Hi, guys. So it is 22nd, and we have been away from the city for, let's see, 9 days. We're in the Catskills in Olivria. Is that what it's called? Olivria? We're kind of in the middle of a state park-ish type of thing. Gone hiking every day. Um, we have had chocolate every day. And we are longing for some connections and a reason to um, brush our hair and put lipstick on. So here we are. I'm going to read some fairy tales from this book that was originally um, written in 1897. And while it says Andrew Lang, it's actually mostly done by his wife, who he calls Mrs. Lang in the in the front of the book. But her name is actually Nora, Leonora Blanche Aline Lang. So I'm going to start with um, a tale called How the Hermit Helped to Win the King's Daughter. Translated from the Sicilian via the German. How the Hermit Helped to Win the King's Daughter. Long ago, there lived a very rich man who had 3 sons. When he felt himself to be dying, he divided his property between them, making them share alike both in money and lands. Soon after he died, the king set forth a proclamation through the whole country that whoever could build a ship that should float both on land and sea should have his daughter to wife. The eldest brother, when he heard it, said to the other, "I think I will spend some of my money in trying to build that ship, as I should like to have the king for my father in law." So he called together all the shipbuilders in the land and gave them orders to begin the ship without delay. And trees were cut down and great preparations made. And in a few days, everybody knew what it was all for. And there was a crowd of old people pressing round the gates of the yard where the young man spent the most of his day. "Ah, master, give us work," they said, "so that we may earn our bread." But he only gave them hard words and spoke roughly to them. "You are old and have lost your strength. Of what use are you?" And he drove them away. Then came some boys and prayed him, "Master, give us work." But he answered them, "Of what use can you be, weaklings as you are? Get you gone." And if any presented themselves that were not skilled workmen, he would have none of them. At last there knocked at the gate a little old man with a long white beard and said, "Will you give me work so that I may earn my bread?" But he was only driven away like the rest. The ship took a long while to build and cost a great deal of money, and when it was launched, a sudden squall rose, and it fell to pieces, and with it all the young man's hopes of winning the princess. By this time he had not a penny left. So he went back to his 2 brothers and told his tale. And the second brother said to himself as he listened, "Certainly he has managed very badly, but I should like to see if I can't do better and win the princess for my own self." So he called together all the shipbuilders throughout the country and gave them orders to build a ship which should float on the land as well as on the sea. But his heart was no softer than his brothers, and every man that was not a skilled workman was chased away with hard words. Last came the white bearded man, but he fared no better than the rest. When the ship was finished, the launch took place, and everything seemed going smoothly, when a gale sprang up, and the vessel was dashed to pieces on the rocks. The young man had spent his whole fortune on it, and now it was all swallowed up. He was forced to beg shelter from his youngest brother. When he told his story, the youngest said to himself, "I'm not rich enough to support us all 3. I had better take my turn, and if I manage to win the princess, there will be her fortune as well as my own for us to live on." So he called together all the shipbuilders in the kingdom and gave orders that a new ship should be built. Then all the old people came and asked for work, and he answered cheerfully, "Oh, yes, well, there's plenty for everybody." And when the boys begged to be allowed to help, he found something that they could do. And when the old man with the long white beard stood before him, praying that he might earn his bread, he replied, "Oh, father, I could not suffer you to work. You shall be overseer and look after the rest." Now the old man was a holy hermit, and when he saw how kind hearted the youth was, he determined to do all he could for him to gain the wish of his heart. By and by, when the ship was finished, the hermit said to his young friend, "Now you can go and claim the king's daughter, for the ship will float both by land and sea." "Oh, good father," cried the young man, "you will not forsake me. Stay with me, I pray you, and lead me to the king." "If you wish it, I will," said the hermit, "on condition that you will give me half of anything you get." "Oh, if that is all," answered he, "it is easily promised." And they set out together on the ship. After they had gone some distance, they saw a man standing in a thick fog, which he was trying to put into a sack. "Oh, good father," exclaimed the youth, "what can he be doing?" "Ask him," said the old man. "What are you doing, my fine fellow?" "I am putting the fog into my sack. That is my business." "Ask him if he will come with us," whispered the hermit. And the man answered, "If you will give me enough to eat and drink, I will gladly stay with you." So they took him on their ship, and the youth said as they started off again, "Good father, before we were two, and now we are three." After they had traveled a little further, they met a man who had torn up half the forest and was carrying all the trees on his shoulders. "Good father," exclaimed the youth, "only look! What can he have done that for?" "Ask him why he has torn up all those trees." And the man replied, "Why, I've merely been gathering a handful of brushwood." "Beg him to come with us," whispered the hermit. And the strong man answered, "Willingly, as long as you give me enough to eat and drink." And he came on the ship. And the youth said to the hermit, "Good father, before we were three, now we are four." The ship traveled on again, and some miles further on, they saw a man drinking out of a stream till he had nearly drunk it dry. "Good father," said the youth, "just look at that man. Did you ever see anybody drink like that?" "Ask him why he does it," answered the hermit. "Why, there's nothing very odd in taking a mouthful of water," replied the man, standing up. "Beg him to come with us." And the youth did so. "With pleasure, as long as you give me enough to eat and drink." And the youth whispered to the hermit, "Good father, before we were four, and now we are five." A little way along, they noticed another man in the middle of a stream who was shooting into the water. "Good father," said the youth, "what can he be shooting at?" "Ask him," said the hermit. "Hush, hush," cried the man. "Now you have frightened it away. In the underworld sits a quail on a tree, and I wanted to shoot it with us." And the man replied, "With all my heart, as long as I get enough to eat and drink." So they took him into the ship, and the young man whispered, "Good father, before we were five, and now we are six." Off they went again, and before they had gone far, they met a man striding towards them whose steps were so long that while one foot was on the north of the island, the other was right down in the south. "Good father, look at him, what long steps he takes." "Ask him why he does it," replied the hermit. "Oh, I'm only going out for a little walk," answered he. "Ask him if he will come with us." "Gladly, if you'll give me as much as I want to eat and drink," said he, climbing up into the ship. And the young man whispered, "Good father, before we were six, and now we are seven." But the hermit knew what he was about and why he gathered these strange people into the ship. After many days, at last they reached the town where lived the king and his daughter. They stopped the vessel right in front of the palace, and the young man went in and bowed low before the king. "O Majesty, I have done your bidding, and now is the ship built that can travel over land and sea. Give me my reward, and let me have your daughter to wife." But the king said to himself, "What? Am I to wed my daughter to a man of whom I know nothing? Not even whether he be rich or poor, a knight or a beggar." And aloud he spake, "It is not enough that you have managed to build the ship. You must find a runner who shall take this letter to the ruler of the underworld and bring me the answer back in an hour. That is not in the bond, answered the young man. Well, do as you like, replied the king, only you will not get my daughter. The young man went out sorely troubled to tell his old friend what had happened. Silly boy, cried the hermit, accept his terms at once and send off the long-legged man with the letter. He will take it in no time at all. So the youth's heart leapt for joy, and he returned to the king. Majesty, I accept your terms. Here is the messenger who will do what you wish. The king had no choice but to give the man the letter, and he strode off, making short work of the distance that lay between the palace and the underworld. He soon found the ruler, who looked at the letter and said to him, Wait a little while I write the answer. But the man was so tired with his quick walk that he went sound asleep and forgot all about his errand. All this time the youth was anxiously counting the minutes till he could get back, and stood with his eyes fixed on the road down which his messenger must come. What can be keeping him? He said to the hermit when the hour was nearly up. Then the hermit sent for the man who could hit everything he aimed at, and said to him, Just see why the messenger stays so long. Oh, he's sound asleep in the palace of the underworld. However, I can soon wake him. Then he drew his bow and shot an arrow straight into the man's knee. The messenger awoke with a start, and when he saw that the hour had almost run out, he snatched up the answer and rushed back with such speed that the clock had not yet struck when he entered the palace. Now the young man thought he was sure of his bride. But the king said, Still, you have not done enough. Before I give you my daughter, you must find a man who can drink half the contents of my cellar in one day. That is not in the bond, complained the poor youth. Well, do as you like, only you will not get my daughter. The young man went sadly out and asked the hermit what he was to do. Silly boy, said he, why tell the man to do it who drinks up everything? So they sent for the man and said, Do you think you are able to drink half the royal cellar in one day? Oh, dear me, yes, and as much more as you want, answered he. I am never satisfied. The king was not pleased at the young man agreeing so readily, but he had no choice and ordered the servant to be taken downstairs. Oh, how he enjoyed himself. All day long he drank and drank and drank, till instead of half the cellar he had drunk the whole, and there was not a cask but what stood empty. And when the king saw this, he said to the youth, You have conquered, and I can no longer withhold my daughter. But as her dowry, I shall only give so much as one man can carry away. But, answered he, let a man be ever so strong, he cannot carry more than 100 weight, and what is that for a king's daughter? Well, do as you like, I have had my say. It is your affair, not mine, said the king. The young man was puzzled and did not know what to reply, for though he would gladly have married the princess without a sixpence, he had spent all his money in building the ship, and he knew he could not give her all she wanted. So he went to the hermit and said to him, The king will only give me for her dowry as much as a man can carry. I have no money of my own left, and my brothers have none either. Silly boy, why, you have only got to fetch the man who carried half the forest on his shoulders. And the youth was glad and called the strong man and told him what he must do. Take everything you can till you are bent double. Never mind if you leave the palace bare. The strong man promised and nobly kept his word. He piled all he could see on his back, chairs, tables, wardrobes, chests of gold and silver, till there was nothing left to pile. At last he took the king's crown and put it on the top. He carried his burden to the ship and stowed his treasures away, and the youth followed, leading the king's daughter. But the king was left raging in his empty palace, and he called together his army, got ready his ships of war, in order that he might go after the vessel and bring back what had been taken away. And the king's ships sailed very fast and soon caught up with the little vessel, and the sailors all shouted for joy. Then the hermit looked out and saw how near they were, and he said to the youth, Do you see that? The youth shrieked and cried, Ah, good father, it is a fleet of ships, and they are chasing us, and in a few moments they will be upon us. But the hermit bade him call the man who had the fog in his sack, and the sack was opened, and the fog flew out and hung right round the king's ships, so that they could see nothing. So they sailed back to the palace and told the king what strange things had happened. Meanwhile, the young man's vessel reached home in safety. Here is an illustration. Well, here you are once more, said the hermit, and now you can fulfill the promise you made me to give me the half of all you had. That I will do with all my heart, answered the youth, and began to divide all his treasures, putting part on one side for himself and setting aside the other for his friend. Good father, it is finished, he said at length. There's nothing left to divide. Nothing more left, cried the hermit. Why, you have forgotten the best thing of all. What can that be? Asked he. We have divided everything. And the king's daughter, said the hermit. Then the young man's heart stood still, for he loved her dearly. But he answered, It is well. I have sworn, and I will keep my word, and drew his sword to cut her in pieces. When the hermit saw that he held his honor dearer than his wife, he lifted his hand and cried, Hold! She is yours, and all the treasures too. I gave you my help because you had pity on those that were in need. And when you are in need yourself, call upon me, and I will come to you. As he spoke, he softly touched their heads and vanished. The next day, the wedding took place, and the two brothers came to the house, and they all lived happily together. But they never forgot the holy man who had been such a good friend. That was The Hermit and the King's Daughter. The next story is called The Water of Life. Three brothers and one sister lived together in a small cottage, and they loved one another dearly. One day, the eldest brother, who had never done anything but amuse himself from sunrise to sunset, said to the rest, Let us all work hard, and perhaps we shall grow rich and be able to build ourselves a palace. And his brothers and sister answered joyfully, Yes, we will all work. So they fell to working with all their might, till at last they became rich and were able to build themselves a beautiful palace, and everyone came from miles around to see its wonders and to say how splendid it was. No one thought of finding any faults, till at length an old woman, who had been walking through the rooms with a crowd of people, suddenly exclaimed, Yes, it is a splendid palace, but there is still something it needs. And what may that be? A church. When they heard this, the brothers set to work again to earn some more money, and when they had got enough, they set about building a church, which would be as large and beautiful as the palace itself. And after the church was finished, greater numbers of people than ever flocked to see the palace and the church and the vast gardens and magnificent halls. But one day, as the brothers were as usual doing the honors to their guests, an old man turned to them and said, Yes, it is all most beautiful, but there is still something it needs. And what may that be? A pitcher of the water of life, a branch of the tree, the smell of whose flowers gives eternal beauty, and the talking bird. And where am I to find all those? Go to the mountain that is far off yonder, and you will find what you seek. After the old man had bowed politely and taken farewell of them, the eldest brother said to the rest, I will go in search of the water of life, and the talking bird and the tree of beauty. But suppose some evil thing befalls you, asked his sister, how shall we know? You are right, he replied, I had not thought of that. Then they followed the old man and said to him, My eldest brother wishes to seek for the water of life and the tree of beauty and the talking bird that you tell him are needful to make our palace perfect. But how shall we know if any evil thing befall him? So the old man took them a knife and gave it to them, saying, Keep this carefully, and as long as the blade is bright, all is well. But if the blade is bloody, then know that evil has befallen him. The brothers thanked him and departed, and went straight to the palace, where they found the young man making ready to set out for the mountain where the treasures he longed for lay hid. And he walked and he walked and he walked till he had gone a great way, and there he met a giant. "Can you tell me how much further I still have to go before I reach that mountain yonder?" "And why do you wish to go there?" "I am seeking the water of life, the talking bird, and a branch of the tree of beauty. Many have passed by seeking those treasures, but none have ever come back. And you will never come back either unless you mark my words. Follow this path, and when you reach the mountain, you will find it covered with stones. Do not stop to look at them, but keep on your way. As you go, you will hear scoffs and laughs behind you. It will be the stones that mock. Do not heed them. Above all, do not turn round. If you do, you will become as one of them. Walk straight on till you get to the top, and then take all you wish for." The young man thanked him for his counsel and walked and walked till he reached the mountain. And as he climbed, he heard behind him scoffs and jeers, but he kept his eyes steadily closed to them. At last, the noise grew so loud that he lost patience, and he stooped to pick up a stone to hurl into the midst of the clamor, when suddenly his arm seemed to stiffen, and the next moment he was a stone himself. That day, his sister, who thought her brother's steps were long in returning, took out the knife and found the blade was red as blood. Then she cried out to her brothers that something terrible had come to pass. "I will go and find him," said the second, and he went. And he walked and he walked and he walked till he met the giant and asked him if he had seen a young man traveling towards the mountain. And the giant answered, "Yes, I have seen him pass, but I have not seen him come back. The spell must have worked upon him." "Then what can I do to disenchant him and find the water of life, the talking bird, and a branch of the tree of beauty?" "Follow this path, and when you reach the mountain, you will find it covered with stones. Do not stop to look at them, but climb steadily on. Above all, heed not the laughs and scoffs that will arise on all sides, and never turn round. And when you reach the top, you can then take all you desire." The young man thanked him for his counsel and set out for the mountain. But no sooner did he reach it than loud jests and jibes broke out on every side and almost deafened him. For some time he let them rail and pushed boldly on till he had passed the place which his brother had gained. Then suddenly he thought that among the scoffing sounds he heard his brother's voice. He stopped and looked back, and another stone was added to the number. Meanwhile, the sister left at home was counting the days when her two brothers should return to her. The time seemed long, and it would be hard to say how often she took out the knife and looked at its polished blade to make sure that this one at least was still safe. The blade was always bright and clear. Each time she looked, she had the happiness of knowing that all was well, till one evening, tired and anxious, as she frequently was at the end of the day, she took it from its drawer, and behold, the blade was red with blood. Her cry of horror brought her youngest brother to her, and unable to speak, she held out the knife. "I will go," he said. So he walked and he walked, and he walked until he met the giant, and he asked, "Have two young men, making for yonder mountain, passed this way?" And the giant answered, "Yes, they have passed by, but they never came back, and by this I know that the spell has fallen upon them." "Then what must I do to free them?" "Go to the mountain, which you will find so thickly covered with stones that you will hardly be able to place your feet, and ignore the laughs and scoffs." The young man thanked the giant for his counsel and set forth to the mountain, and when he began to climb, there burst forth all around him a storm of scoffs and jeers, but he thought of the giant's words and looked neither to the right hand nor the left, till the mountain top lay straight before him. A moment now, and he would have gained it, when through the groans and yells he heard his brothers' voices. He turned, and there was one stone the more. And all this while his sister was pacing up and down the palace, hardly letting the knife out of her hand, and dreading what she knew she would see and what she did see. The blade grew red before her eyes, and she said, "Now it is my turn." So she walked and she walked, and she walked till she came to the giant and prayed him to tell her if he had seen 3 young men pass that way. "I have seen them pass, but they have never returned, and by this I know that the spell has fallen upon them," repeated the giant. "And what must I do to set them free and to find the water of life and the talking bird and a branch of the tree of beauty?" "You must go to that mountain, which is so full of stones that your feet will hardly find a place to tread. And as you climb, you will hear a noise, as if all the stones in the world were mocking you. But pay no heed to anything you may hear. Once you gain the top, you have gained everything." The girl thanked him for his counsel and set out for the mountain, and scarcely had she gone a few steps upwards when cries and screams broke forth around her, and she felt as if each stone she trod on was a living thing. But she remembered the words of the giant, and knew not what had befallen her brothers, and kept her face steadily towards the mountain top, which grew nearer and nearer every moment. But as she mounted, the clamor increased sevenfold. High above them all rang the voices of her 3 brothers, but the girl took no heed, and at last her feet stood upon the top. Then she looked round and saw lying in a hollow the pool of the water of life, and she took the brazen pitcher that she had brought with her and filled it to the brim. By the side of the pool stood the tree of beauty with the talking bird on one of its boughs, and she caught the bird and placed it in a cage and broke off one of the branches. And there's an illustration. After that, she turned and went joyfully down the hill again, carrying her treasures. But her long climb had tired her out, and the brazen pitcher was very heavy. And as she walked, a few drops of the water spilt onto the stones, and as it touched them, they changed into young men and maidens, crowding about her to give thanks for their deliverance. So she learnt by this how the evil spell might be broken, and she carefully sprinkled every stone till there was not one left. Only a great company of youths and girls who followed her down the mountain, including her brothers. When they arrived at the palace, she did not lose a moment in planting the branch of the tree of beauty and watering it with the water of life. And the branch shot up into a tree and was heavy with flowers, and the talking bird nestled in its branches. Now the fame of these wonders was noised abroad, and the people flocked in great numbers to see the 3 marvels and the maiden who had won them. And among the sightseers came the king's son, who would not go till everything was shown him, and till he had heard how it had all happened. And the prince admired the strangeness and beauty of the treasures in the palace, but more than all, he admired the beauty and the courage and the intelligence of the maiden who had brought them there. So he went home and told his parents and gained their consent to wed her for his wife. Then the marriage was celebrated in the church adjoining the palace, and the bridegroom took her to his own home, where they lived happily forever after. That story was called the Water of Life. And speaking of weather, we learned today that we're going to get a snowstorm tonight with 6 to 9 inches of snow, apparently. We're surrounded by mountains, and this story is called The Merry Wives. There lay 3 houses in a row, in one of which there lived a tailor, in another a carpenter, and in the third a smith. All 3 were married, and their wives were very good friends. They often talked about how stupid their husbands were, but they could never agree as to which of them had the most stupid one. Each one stuck up for her own husband and maintained that it was he. The 3 wives went to church together every Sunday and had a regular good gossip on the way. And when they were coming home from church, they always turned into the tavern, which lay by the wayside, and drank half a pint together. This was at the time when half a pint of brandy cost 3 pence, so that it was just a penny from each of them. But the brandy went up in price, and the taverner said he must have 4 pence for the half pint. They were greatly annoyed at this, for there were only the three of them to share it, and none of them was willing to pay the extra penny. As they went home from the church that day, they decided to wager with each other as to whose husband was the most stupid, and the one who on the following Sunday should be judged to have played her husband the greatest trick should thereafter go free from paying, and each of the two others would give 2 pence for their Sunday's half pint. Next day, the tailor's wife said to her husband, I have some girls coming today to help card my wool. There's a great deal to do, and we must be very busy. I am so annoyed that our watchdog is dead, for in the evening the young fellows will come about to get fun with the girls, and they will get nothing done. If we only had a fierce watchdog, he would have kept them away. Yes, said the man, that would have been a good thing. Listen, good man, said the wife. You must just be the watchdog yourself and scare the fellows away from the house. The husband was not very sure about this, although otherwise he was always ready to give in to her. Oh, yes, you will see, it will work all right, said the wife. And so towards evening, she got the tailor dressed up in a shaggy fur coat, tied a black woolen cloth around his head, and chained him up beside the dog's kennel. There he stood and barked and growled at everyone that moved in his neighborhood. The neighbor wives knew all about this and were greatly amused at it. On the day after this, the carpenter had been out at work and came home quite merry. But as soon as he entered the house, his wife clapped her hands together and cried, My dear, what makes you look like that? You are ill. The carpenter knew nothing about being ill. He only thought that he wanted something to eat, and so he sat down at the table and began his dinner. His wife sat straight in front of him, and with her hands folded, she shook her head and looked at him with an anxious air. You are getting worse, my dear, she said. You are quite pale now. You have a serious illness about you. I can see it by your looks. The husband now began to grow anxious and thought that perhaps he was not quite well. No, indeed, she said, it's high time that you were in bed. She then got him to lie down and piled above him all the bedclothes she could find and gave him various medicines while he grew worse and worse. You will never get over it, said she. I'm afraid you're going to die. Do you think so? Said the carpenter. I can well believe it, for I am indeed very poorly. In a little while she said again, Ah, now I must part with you. Here comes death. Now I must close your eyes. And she did so. The carpenter believed everything that his wife said, and so he believed now that he was dead, and lay still and let her do as she pleased. She got her neighbors summoned, and they helped to lay him in the coffin. It was one of those he himself had made, as a carpenter. But his wife had bored holes in it to let him get some air. She made a soft bed under him and put a coverlet over him, and she folded his hands over his breast. But instead of a flower or a psalm book, she gave him a pint bottle of brandy in his hands. After he had lain for a little, he took a little pull at this, and then another, and another. And he thought this did him good, and soon he was sleeping sweetly and dreaming that he was in heaven. Meanwhile, word had gone round the village that the carpenter was dead and was to be buried the next day. It was now the turn of the smith's wife. Her husband was lying sleeping off the effects of a drinking bout, so she pulled off all his clothes and made him as black as coal from head to foot with ashes, and then let him sleep till far on in the day. The funeral party had already met up at the carpenter's and marched off toward the church with the coffin, when the smith's wife came rushing in to her husband. Gracious man, she said, you are lying there yet? You are sleeping too long. You know you have to go to the funeral. The smith was quite confused. He knew nothing about any funeral. It's our neighbor the carpenter, said his wife, who is to be buried today. They are already halfway to church with him. All right, said the smith, make haste to help me on with my black clothes. What nonsense, said his wife. You have them on already. Be off with you now. The smith looked down at his body and saw that he was a good deal blacker than he usually was, so he caught up his hat and ran out after the funeral. This was already close to the church, and the smith wanted to take part in carrying the coffin like a good neighbor. So he ran with all his might and shouted after them, Hey, wait a little, let me get a hold of him. The people turned around, and saw the black figure coming and thought it was the devil himself, who wanted to get hold of the carpenter. So they threw down the coffin and took to their heels. The lid sprang off the coffin with the shock, and the carpenter woke up and looked out. He remembered the whole affair. He knew that he was dead and was going to be buried, and recognizing the smith, he said to him in a low voice, "My good neighbor, if I hadn't been dead already, I should have laughed myself to death now to see you coming like this to my funeral, naked and covered in ashes." From that time forth, the carpenter's wife drank free of expense every Sunday, for the others had to admit that she had fooled her husband the best.